morning. Well, I guess it probably is afternoon for many of you. It is absolutely afternoon for me. Um, I was just coming in because this was my wake up, and I'm super super excited. Hello, Lucky. How are you doing, beautiful? I'm super super excited about this new find that they are talking about. And what it could mean, just the different things. These articles are also giving us information on, like they're talking about the possibility of a ghost species in Asia as well, which is, hold on just a second, I got a text. Um, so they're talking now about a ghost species possibility in Asia, which is just frigging epic to me. For me, that's like, wow. I mean, I think we're kind of finding a lot of different ghost species currently. And so I'm super, super excited about it. Hello, Wicked. It's good to see you. And I'm super, super excited about what these things could mean for us, right? And so, hey, hey, and so I wanted to bring this in and talk. This was actually not my subject this week. I was going to actually address some stuff with race and the debunction of race theory, right? But this is really kind of cool. And so I figured we'd go ahead and talk about it today instead. But this is one of those things that's just really amazing. And what's really amazing me about this is the skull itself. Like you can see some different features on the skull itself that are just really, oh, to me, like just, oh, yay. So first of all, as I'm getting started, if you're new to my space, just so you know, I think I have a stray hair like falling down and it looks really weird in my video because it looks like this. So we're talking about this new human. um, Things I plots about, right? Things that I get excited about. So if you're new to my space, everybody that gets 1,000 followers on TikTok gets a live space. And so I choose to use my live space to educate, right? I choose to use my live space to, I have a couple of degrees. You can see one on the wall there. I choose to use my live space to educate people about what is going on in the world of paleoanthropology, who we have been as humans in the past, just different things that a lot of people aren't aware of, right? Because I do not believe that education, um, hold on a second. Sorry, my kid is texting me. He got some weird text. Okay, this, I found it today. Like, okay, so articles, like the journal article seems to be from 2021, right? But they've got new information. And so this is like just today, like I just got coming across, and not this article, but one of the articles is actually only coming out, like it is a brand new article. So well, no, okay, so that one's May of 20 of 19. This is, I think, the one that I had seen originally. I want to see what the date is on that, 6 hours ago. So this article that this picture is taken from, it came out today. There have been looking at this specific site and the different artifacts or different remains in this site for, since it looks like 2019, like the end of 2019. A lot of times what happens, and I was talking to somebody else today, so I'm going to explain that as well. But let me go ahead really quick. If you're new to my space, this is a space that I use to educate. I don't believe education should be kept behind a $40,000 a year paywall, and I don't believe it should be gatekept by language that most people can't understand. Even if you have extensive degrees, sometimes I have to look up 10 words in a paragraph, right? So I think that we should be more educated and we should have more knowledge, and it should be easier to understand. And so that's what I'm here doing. I ask that in my space that we keep racism out of my space. I don't deal with race. Race has been debunked. I will deal with racism, and I will deal with how race has been debunked frequently. We still want to make sure that we're not interacting with racist content. You won't like my response to racist content. The same thing when it comes to phobias based on gender or desire. I don't deal with phobias based on gender and desire in a way that you will appreciate. I try and make sure I'm always positive, but you probably won't appreciate the correction that you're getting from me. So keep your racism racism, keep your phobias based on gender desire, take them somewhere else. Yes, it's 300,000 years old, right? Anyways, okay, so um, and we do a lot of conversation about paleoanthropology, about early Homo sapiens, and about who we have been as a species in this space. Because I personally see that biologically we are a nurturing and communal and creative species. These are things that are innately us. And I want people to understand the innateness of us that is beautiful, because so often we tend to think that we're innately evil, that we believe the indoctrination that we've all suffered under. And I want people to see the beauty of our species. And so that's kind of what I do in this space. That's kind of what this is, right? Uh, White Pearl, nobody said this is the oldest skull. So I don't know what you think you're saying is wrong. You're trying to state something is wrong that nobody ever stated. You're the only one that's brought that into the anything, right? So when we're looking at that, we need to make sure that as humans that we're taking care of each other. We are all indoctrinated to think that somebody else is what's the problem, that it's people of color that are the problem, or white people that are the problem, that it's religion that's the problem, that it's the houseless that's the problem, that it's the immigrants that is the problem. We're all indoctrinated into this thought process, and this indoctrination really keeps us at this lower level where the people that are giving us that indoctrination are maintaining their height in the stratification, right? They're maintaining their rulership, they're maintaining their control over society. And when we can see that it's not you or me that's the issue, but the narcissistic God kings that are in charge of all of us and have been for like 10,000 years, we can absolutely see that falling for that is keeping us in this space. So we work on that. I am an archaeologist and anthropologist. One of my focuses is paleoanthropology. It is fascinating to me. The other focus is Bronze and Iron Age and Stone Age Northwestern European cultures. So those are a couple of my focuses. I have a dedication as an Indigenous person to Indigenous knowledge and things that improve Indigenous knowledge, right? But I don't come in here and teach those things. I just give those informations to other Indigenous people so that they can use that information, because it's just how I am. So that is one of my focuses. And so this for me is like kid in a candy store. This for me is so huge. This is a new find. As I said, the idea that this is a third human lineage is coming out today. This is finds that are found roughly 3 years ago, 4 years ago, it looks like. And of course, they have to compile it. So when we're looking at things, if it's coming out today, it's probably taken a couple of years. So this one, it looks like the earliest I've seen of an article on it, and all of these articles are on my inwitaord.com site underneath bibliography, underneath New Human. So when we're looking at this, like say we find Homo florensis in 2003. It's going to take a couple of years for the people that find Homo florensis and the initial archaeologists working on Homo florensis to the oldest skull found in the world of a Homo or of a hominin species is 7 million years ago in a lake bed in Chad. It is not the oldest Homo sapien. The oldest Homo sapien find is 300,000 years ago in Morocco, just so you know, because I see the argument going on in chat. So when we're looking at new species. So say they discover Florensis in 2003. To get to the point that they're publishing a paper and letting the rest of the world know about Homo florensis takes a couple of years. You have to compile all your information. You got to get all your artifacts out. You got to look at all your fossils. You got to look at all of your belongings. And then when you're done looking at all of those things, then you put together a research paper and you publish. And that publication has to be peer reviewed. You have to have data in it so that people can retest so that they can make sure that it's correct, right? And so after that publication is peer reviewed and it's been published, it might still take a couple more years for mainstream media to catch up. So for you to find out, unless you're in a field that studies these things, right? And even those of us in the field that studies these things, it might not be something that we even see because we're not looking for it until mainstream media puts it out and we're like, oh shit, that's cool, right? And so that's kind of what's happening today. So this is something that it looks like was really looked at or really started being understood in 2019. Excuse me, I'm taking off my shoes. Really started being understood in 2019. And then after that, they of course, publish a paper. The journal article that has been published, it looks like is, so the first PhysOrg article that was published is published in 2019. And this is the second PhysOrg org article that has been published on it. The journal article on it looks like, or the scientific journal article on it looks like it was published in 21. But for it to become the decision that it is a new lineage is probably relatively recent. And that is because they've taken the skull itself and they've started to compile all of the information of that skull, and they started to look a little bit deeper. Initially, this was thought about as being maybe an archaic Homo sapien. And now they're looking at it and they're seeing that this isn't necessarily an archaic Homo sapien. It might be a completely new lineage. A part of this is the fact that DNA testing has recently informed us that there are other humans there, right? That we have ghost species within our DNA lineage, and that we have Neanderthal and Denisovan within our DNA lineage. And then another part of it is in the last 20 years, we've actually found 5 different species in the fossil record that we lived alongside of. And so, with that new discovery in the last 20 years, we're starting to re-look at things. So, like when we look at the new find of Longi, Homo longi from the Long Cave in China. Long means dragon. And so the dragon man that came across the news feeds for many people in the last couple of years is something that they found in 1970. So you're like, well, why didn't we look at it as a new human in 1970? Well, when we find it in 1970, we don't think of it as a new human. It's not because we've only got one other human that lived alongside us, Homo neanderthalis, at that time period. And so we think, oh, it must be a Neanderthal, it must be an ancient archaic sapien, right? But as we're looking and we're seeing that there are lots of new humans, lots of people that we lived alongside, lots of other genus Homo species that we lived alongside, we start to reevaluate the different things that we have. So with Longi, it was found in 1970, but they didn't start reevaluating it as being maybe another species until after they discovered Denisovan. And then after they discovered Denisovan, they start to reevaluate Longi and go, well, is Longi like a Denisovan, or is Longi a whole nother species? We still don't know with Longi because we haven't gotten DNA out of Longi. And we only have a skull cap of Longi where we don't have a skull cap of Denisovan, right? Is it paywalled, Floppity? So that is one problem that I find with a lot of journal articles is they are paywalled. I do try and put mainstream articles that are easily accessed for people because a lot of the journal articles are paywalled, and I can't tell sometimes because I have credentials that log me in automatically whether or not it's going to be paywalled for somebody else. Okay, so don't worry about that article itself. We're going to go over the journal article a little bit in here, so you will get some of that information because I do have some access to it. I'm not sure if I have total access to it because I was reading through it, but I don't think I got all the way through it. And then the 2 articles on phys.org that are put in there will give you some more information that should not be behind a paywall. I don't know if phys.org is behind a paywall, and it's just not behind a paywall for me. If it's behind a paywall, let me know, please. And you can actually go to those articles and then pull information. Like, so how I found the journal article was in the this article itself. It talks about what cave this is in. And so when you look at what cave this is in, you can take that cave into Google Scholar and put that cave and put human or put new species. Like, let me make sure I have the correct pronunciation. Let me look at this spelling. Hulongdong Cave. So it is at the site Hulongdong, which you can find the spelling of on this article, which is again on my website, right? And then you can take the Hulongdong Cave or Hulong hominin. Take Hulong hominin or Hulong species and put that into a Google Scholar search, and it should give you some. No, it's a new species, Ducray. It's a whole new species. And it should give you the ability to access articles that you can actually get into. Okay, so yes, thank you, Atira. So that you can actually look into the articles and get articles that you can access. This is kind of why I put, just regular articles up so that you can take them and go to Google Scholar and actually get to articles that you can access, because so many of us can't access so many articles. Hello, and hello to everybody that I missed. Hello, Nicole, but hello to everybody that I missed coming in. It's really hard for me to concentrate on talking about the subject and catch everybody coming in, which is why I'm not really good at responding so much to comments. I kind of have to distance myself from the comments sometimes. You might not know that if you're new here. Sometimes the comments can be kind of problematic, so I really have to distance myself. Otherwise, I get really distracted and we'll be off on a whole nother subject, right? So just so you know, if I'm not really interactive, it's mainly because of the fact that if I start getting interactive, we'll be on a whole different subject at the time. So when we're looking at this, And I'm actually going to pull up the journal article myself so that I can actually take a look. And I probably can't access the whole thing. It is giving me some access, but it is not going to give me the whole access. Eldawise is really hard. So Elsevier, it's not Eldawise. I always think of it as Eldawise. Elsevier is really hard to get actual things from. But this will give you like you can see the basis of it, right? And so I will be going over a couple of the things that we see within this article that I can actually see and that I can actually access, right? So what we are looking at here is a new human species, a new Homo species that they are finding in a cave in China. The cave in China is called Hulong Dong. I believe Dong is cave. So I believe Hulong is the name of the cave itself. I believe I read that somewhere that Dong actually means cave within this. So, and what this would mean in that name is like, okay, so we named Neanderthal because we found them in Neanderthal Valley, right? We named Denisovan because we found it in Denisova Cave. We named Florensis because we found it on the island of Flores. We named Naledi because we found it in the Rising Star Caves. Naledi is star, right? So we name them after where we find them. So the likelihood is when we name this, it is probably going to be Hulong something, okay? And so when we're looking at the naming of species, we name them after where we found them. We name them after the space that we find them in, okay? So this one is found in Hulongdong, China. Hulong is the name of the cave, Dong being the cave in China. There are other, okay, so let me look really quick. I want to make sure because as I was reading, it was talking about, no, okay, those are talking about the comparisons. I wanted to make sure that we were looking at the comparisons and not like possible other sites. So my understanding is this is Hula HLD6. So when we look at graves and we look at different sites, what we do is we name the site and then we name the number. So like Kreb from Earth Children series is Shanidar, which is this cave, one, because he was the first body uncovered in the Shanidar cave, right? Well, the cave is named Denisova, RJ. The cave is the Denisova cave, and that's why they named it Denisova, and it's not because of the hermit, just so you're aware. The cave might be named for the hermit, but the species is named for the cave, just so we know. So we are looking at HLD6, and you can actually see it. It says it right here on this little line of text. And it's a virtual reconstruction of the skull of HLD6. Now, when you look at this skull, it's George is a great name. We name our spiders George in our house too. I like the name George. That's what my daughter names spiders. So George is a great name. When we're looking at this skull, you can see most of us, I would think, can actually see some significant differences between you and I and this skull, right? But it also doesn't look like Neanderthal or Erectus. So when we look at a Neanderthal skull, we see that there's that mid-face prognosis. So their nose kind of sticks out here and their eyebrow ridge is very heavy, but there's nose and their mid-face sticks out like this. And then their chin shelves back or doesn't shelf at all. It just kind of slides back, right? But we can see with this that that's not what is happening. We know that with modern sapiens that we don't have a heavy brow ridge. We don't have this shelf-like brow ridge, right? We just have this kind of light brow ridge, that we have no mid-face prognosis. We have what we call kind of a flat face, right? And then we have kind of this sharp, pointy chin. Now, this is something that no other species has. This is what we call a basal trait, basal meaning only to our species, a basal trait of sapien, and that is the mental eminence on the chin. Your ex probably had similar to that brow, but it wasn't quite what this is. And it is a difference. I know that we've all seen people with receding chins. And so we're like, well, you got a Neanderthal chin. Or we've all seen people that seem to have more mid-face prognosis or mid-face kind of sticks out a little bit more. So we're like, oh, well, I thought that we didn't have those in sapiens. Or we see people that have a heavier brow ridge. There is a difference. There is an actual morphological difference when you look at the skull. The brow ridge of a Neanderthal is so pronounced it looks almost like a shelf up here, which we do get pronounced brow ridge, but we don't get them so pronounced that they look like a shelf here. And so there is somewhat of a difference, but I do know that we've all seen people and we're like, ah, you look like this, or you look kind of primitive, or, you're an X, so I'm really going to say it. Uh, but we do see that there is actually some actual difference between that. What we're looking at with this skull, though, if you're looking at this skull, what you're probably like, what might stand out to you, what really stands out to me is that we are looking at a species that has that brow ridge, right? And this is kind of this arched brow ridge, and we don't have this at all. We don't have like this heavy middle space. It kind of sinks down. Like we have a little bit of a brow here, right? Like it might kind of stick out a little bit if we're feeling it, right? But here kind of dips down, right? And you can see on this that that doesn't dip down in the middle, that it makes what we call an M kind of shape, right? And it is all of it is sticking out, right? Well, we see that brow ridge within Neanderthals and we see that brow ridge within Homo erectus. But when we're looking at erectus and Neanderthals, what we see as along with that brow ridge is some mid-face prognosis. And this is where the middle of the face kind of sticks out. This gives us heavier or more sinuses behind the nose and a few different attributes that we see in Neanderthal and erectus. So we see that this face is flat. It doesn't have that mid-face prognosis. So it's flat like us. And I'm not exactly sure what we're seeing with the chin on this. So there's a couple of different things that I've read about the chin on this, and it looks to me, so if I'm looking at the skull, it looks to me like it does have a little bit of a mental eminence to it, doesn't it? Like it does look like it might have a little bit of a bump when you're looking at it from that frontal view, but when you're looking at it from that side view, it doesn't look like it has that bump, right? So it doesn't look like it has that um absolutely, Kagar. One second. It doesn't look like it has that bump from the side view, but it does kind of look like it does from the front view. Let me go ahead and answer this question. The question is, if Denisovan remains are mainly found in mainland Asia, can you explain why Papua New Guineans, Papuans, and Malaysians have more Denisovan DNA than Siberians and East Asians? So Siberians have no Denisovan DNA to my knowledge. It is only seen in Southeast Asia, and it is seen in the islands of the South Pacific. It is seen in Australia or Australasia. It is seen in Turtle Island and Abayalian indigenous people. So Turtle Island is North America and Abayala is South America. So it's seen as those groups. I think that there's probably a few reasons for this. So we find that the finds that we see of Denisova and Denisova Cave are like 90,000 years old or prior to that, right? So at this point in time, there's no ice in that region. It is in an interglacial period, so it's a good region to live in, right? We're not moving really out of the Levant area at this time, or out of Saudi Arabia at this time, and so like that's our furthest out of Africa that we've gotten at this time, and so by the time we really start moving out, we're actually in the middle of a full glaciation, right? So around 50,000 years ago, when we really start moving out, though, Indigenous Australians are out before that. Indigenous Australians are 70,000 years in Australia. So what we're looking at is that that whole entire upper part is covered in ice still. So the Denisovan, like the Neanderthal, are probably moving down to the lower part of Asia. And so while we're not seeing a lot of their remains currently, because we only currently have their remains in Denisova Cave, right? Unless Longi is Denisovan, and we're not sure yet. So they're moving down into the southeastern part of Eurasia, and in moving down to the southeastern part of Eurasia at the same time that Homo sapien is kind of moving out of the Levant area and the no, Jackie, I haven't. I'll have a look at that. The Levant area and over in and across and into Turtle Island and Abayala and into Australia and into the islands down in there. Denisova has moved down into that area. So we're coming across them in the area of Southeast Asia and in the I mean, I don't know if they made it to the islands themselves or if we just carried their genes into the islands, but we're coming across them in Southeast Asia. And as we're coming across them in Southeast Asia, it is because the ice has driven them out of the northern regions of East Asia. And this is the time that they're down there and we're down there. We do know, like in Denisova Cave, after the Ice Age, that we find Homo sapien in Denisova Cave as well as Neanderthal and Denisovan in Denisova Cave. So this would be after the ice is receding. We're moving up and we're moving into a space that they've lived into for a long time and most likely moving into it with them. So we're probably all together. Um, Yet we are finding that the vast majority of the genomics that we see of Denisovan are absolutely in Southeast Asia, the islands of the South Pacific, Australia, Turtle Island, which is North America, and Abayala, which is South America. And those are the only spaces that we see the genomics for Denisovan. We do not see the Denisovan genomics in Siberia or in Northern Asia. This is one of those things that is kind of made archaeologists and anthropologists relook at the route to North America and South America, Turtle Island and Abayala, because we see that, like, am I going all the way down here to get this and then going all the way up here instead of going down across this? And the islands of the South Pacific appear and disappear. So there are islands there that we've never seen, and there will be islands there that we haven't seen yet, right? And so it's possible that they used many of the islands in the South Pacific to cross that we haven't found because those islands have disappeared. There's also that Southeast Asia is a much bigger continent in this time period. Like, its space is much bigger. Its sea level is lower. We call these two continents. Hold on a second. Ancient continent of Asia and Australia. Let me get the names of what we used to call, or what we call, these ancient. Nope, 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 nope. That's not it. There's like, and it's like Su. It starts with an S. They both do. And I cannot remember what they are off the top of my head. But there is a lot of land that is no longer seen. Because it has gone underneath the sea level, and we actually have names, and for some reason it's not actually showing up those names off of the search. So I'd have to like get into bigger, but there are actually different names for what Australia was during the last interstitial period, or the last max glaciation. So when you have a max glaciation, it kind of gobbles up all the water. The ice gobbles up all the water, so your sea level's lower, and so you get more Sundaland. Thank you. It's Sundaland, and then Sundaland and Sura. I think the other one has an R in it, but the Sundaland is the Southeast Asian area, right? And so Sundaland being the Southeast Asian area that has more land mass than it does now. And then there's another one for Australia that's the same thing, where it's more land mass than it is now. Sundaland is probably the word I need. Sahul. It's Sunda and Sahul. So Australia at the time is called Sahul, and Southeast Asia at the time in that space. This is just a quick one off of Wikipedia because it has an image of it. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll show you guys really quick what this actually looks like. Let me switch my camera really quick. So let me make sure that you can see what I'm doing here. Okay, so you see that Sahul. So this is the island of New Guinea, right? So you see that there's all this land mass between what was called Sahul, which is now Australia. The kind of more yellow here, this is the land masses that we have now. And this color here is the land mass that was exposed by the dropping of the sea, okay? So we're looking at how Sunda here, like there's land between Sumatra and Borneo, right? Like that south tip, right? And then we see down here that there's more land, and there's land between Australia and, oh gosh, what was that? I had it off the top of my head just a second ago. But you see that there's more land mass here, right? And so during that time, there is something else that you should see here, though. So this here, right here, this kind of line right here that you can see where there's like this dotted line. So this here has never been above sea level, right? So this water has always been here. So this is called the Wallace line here, right? And this Wallace line here, we can see that there's different animals here than there are here because of this Wallace line. And this Wallace line has never actually been above sea level. The water has never dropped so drastically that this was not water, right? And there's a couple of different things within there, a couple of different lines that you can see. But the Wallace one is actually the Wallace Trench is one of the things that we call it. And what it is it's always been uh, water, right? So the island of Flores is actually in the middle of that. So it actually proves the crossing of water to get to the island of Flores by Homo erectus. Same thing with the island in the Philippines of Luzon, where we found Homo luzonensis, right? So this both proves crossing of water by Homo erectus because, right? We know that these have always been water, so we had to cross water to get to spaces below them. So when we're looking at Sunda and Sahul, we are seeing that there is way more land mass in that time period. But when we're looking at that way more land mass in that time period, there's still water to get to it. Like you still have to cross water to get to it. And when we're looking at it, we can actually see where land mass has disappeared. So it's quite possible that there were people living in that land mass and there are artifacts there. We see the same thing in the islands of the South Pacific because they're in what we call the Ring of Fire. This is a volcanic ring in the South Pacific. And you can kind of see it when you look at a map and you trace the islands, that they're just kind of this shelf, this ring, and then it gets really deep in a certain area, right? And so when we're looking at that, we know that there are islands that kind of appear and disappear. Not like one island appears and disappears, but like an island appears and becomes an island, and it might be there for several thousand years and then it disappears. So when we're looking at that and we're looking at the DNA from Denisovans, we're absolutely re-looking at our concept of how people got to Turtle Island and Abya. Again, Turtle Island is North America and Abya is South America. And so when we're looking at that, it's really changing our perspective, right? So there are starting to do a whole lot of underwater archaeology, Nubian, and that underwater archaeology might give us more information as we're moving along. Underwater archaeology is kind of in a development phase and is really kind of taking off. So we might actually find more information. The cool thing about underwater is the fact that when it's fully submerged, especially if it's in a really acidic or acrobic environment, I can't remember which one because those are words that don't work for me. When it's in one of those environments, it'll actually preserve it longer than it would if it was exposed. So we might actually find information from that, right? They do need to be checking more cave systems. They need to be doing a lot of things. Fortunately, we're at a space in an age where archaeology and anthropology are including many indigenous groups, many minority groups, which means that the understanding of what's going on is shifting, right? So if I look at something with my indigenous eyes, I'm going to see something different than somebody who is a Western thought eyes, right? Like somebody from Europe whose entire thought process is Western thought. My indigenous eyes are going to see a different possibility. And as we have Black people and indigenous people moving into these fields, especially when we have like Black people in Africa or Australia who are moving into these fields and taking part in these fields, they're giving a broader understanding of the possibilities. And when we see this broader understanding, the Japanese pyramid underwater is just fantastic, fascinating. It has been for a hot minute. But when we're seeing these broader possibilities, what we're seeing with these broader possibilities and this broader understanding is that new understandings of what could possibly have been happening is really there. One thing that really stuck out to me about the Cave of Bones, a documentary on Netflix that's going over Homo naledi, right? It's not my job, Ricardo. So when we're looking at the Cave of Bones, one of the things that stood out was Lee Berger actually stated within that he's like, once he made it back into that cave, he could see things that he just assumed that the other people around him were seeing that they didn't see, right? Like he's like, I got back there and I could realize that this is 100% a burial. Whereas before, he had kind of told the other archaeologists, a couple of whom are actually from that area, right? He kind of told the other archaeologists, well, I'm not sure if that's what it is. But when he went to it and he saw it, he could see their perception of it, right? And so when we look at that, it's absolutely this huge shift and this huge change when you get people who are from indigenous groups, when you get people who are from non-Western thought groups into that academic space. They really bring a new shift of understanding, and the Western academics are then able to understand things in a different perspective. That really, really sucks on the not having Netflix for not watching this. I'm not sure if I can find it elsewhere. I will look around and see if I can find it on places that are not Netflix so that people can watch Cave of Bones as well. I do have Lee Berger's lecture on this from last year on my website under, I think, a videos tab. So if you want to go to that, that might actually give you some information. Let me see. I'm looking right now. I want to make sure that I actually have. Might not be there. Let me see if I can find. Mm-mm. Okay, so I thought that I have, and I know I thought I put a couple videos up there. If not, I'll go ahead and look through and put the lecture up there and make sure. Absolutely, Althea. It's a really cool video to watch. And what's really cool about it is when you look at it, you can see there are going to be a lot of things that just stand out to you that you're like, holy shit. There's one part that I'm like, that looks like runes. Like that looks like writing. That on the wall, that looks like runes. So there's parts where you can see clear evidence of fire, just different things. It's pretty cool. And this is like 335,000 to 235,000 years ago as Naledi. So before we were ever around as a species. So when we're looking at this skull, though, and we're looking at finding new species, it's really interesting to have indigenous or local, groups of people coming in. So, like if I, as an archaeologist from the United States, go into China to do archaeology, it's called Cave of Bones. Well, it's called Unknown, which is the series, and then the documentary itself is called Cave of Bones. Um, when I if I as an American archaeologist were to go to China and not listen to the people of China about what that space is, there's a lot of problem to that. And we can easily see the problem to that. The problem to that is I don't understand what the fuck is going on in that area because I'm not from that area. Whereas somebody from that area is going to understand what is going on in that area, right? So when we look at this difference of understanding and bringing in newer thought processes and newer understanding, we can see how this is going to shift. And when we look at a lot of these finds, what we're seeing is so our current oldest dating of Homo sapien is 300,000 years ago from a find in Morocco. This find has been on our record for I think like the 50s or 60s. Like we have had that skeleton since the 50s or 60s. We just, we just redated it. We had been using the older dating techniques. And so we thought it was only 40 to 50,000 years old. But when we redate it, we were able to use, I think they use like a strontium isotope dating. And when they're redating it, that redating of it gives us a new data of 300,000 years ago, right? So as we're developing new tools and we're using new things, it is all of those new things that we're bringing about. This is kind of like a classroom environment, not like a guest environment. Uh, I mean, I do sometimes have in guest environment, but this is not one of those environments. And so I'm not bringing up other people. No, there's nothing to be sorry for. It's not a sorry. I'm just letting you know, I want you to understand that I'm not doing it because of you or because of what you don't have. Like no, I don't care if somebody has a master's in anything, right? It's more the fact that it gets in a different topic, or I can't get out all the information that I'm trying to get out because it goes somewhere else, or because somebody else is talking, which is great in certain things. But when we're doing that, it means that what I'm trying to do doesn't get done, basically. And I just try and make sure that I have certain environments that are just kind of lecture only, though I don't want to really lecture anybody, right? Just because. Yeah, so I just want you to know it's not because of a lack of degree or anything like that. It's just that this particular live is about me talking a lot. So if I get distracted, it doesn't work very well. So Jackie, it is strontium. So let me see if I can actually type it here. And so this, and I don't know if that's what they were using on it. I don't have the article on it, but they have different. And I may be spelling this wrong, to be really honest, because I can speak big words, but I can't spell big words very well, right? So so they redated the Moroccan find and found that find is actually 260,000 years older than they thought it was because they used the newer dating techniques. That's just one of the newer dating techniques. There's about 7 or 8 different dating techniques, and all of those different dating techniques are actually like pulling out things from the air, pulling out different things from the bones, than carbon 14 was. Carbon 14 was more about dating the environment around than it was about dating the actual thing itself. And so these are just new techniques. And a lot of these are things that we use to kind of confirm carbon 14 dating as well, because carbon 14 dating can be somewhat problematic. So, and again, I'm not sure. Um, it is. It's a pattern recognition thing. I'm not well, and it's also a linguistic thing. So, like, we've talked, you and I, Sleepy, about how Cymraeg is very syllabic. Not syllabic. That's not the word I'm looking for. But how certain languages they follow the spelling, right? And certain languages don't follow the spelling, right? Whereas Cymraeg follows the spelling. You can like uh, uh, syllabic from the spelling. Certain language phonetic. Thank you. It's a phonetic language. So Cymraeg is a phonetic language. So you can look at the spelling of Cymraeg and see what it means. Where Cymraeg, whereas like English, you can't look at the spelling and see what it is supposed to sound like half the time, right? You know, like bomb and boom, right? So I think that's a part of it too, because as I say it, it doesn't actually like give me all of the syllables in the word when I say English words, right? So when we're looking at these things, we're looking at a new influx of information because we have people coming in who are not so much orientated in Western thought. And so when we see things like the skull, what we're seeing is something that has been in the, been looked at for a few years in this case. And yet it took a couple of years for people to see new information, to people to like kind of gather that new information. And so when we're looking at it now, when they were first looking at it, they were like, well, maybe this is an archaic Homo sapien, like right between Homo erectus and Homo sapien, right? Um, and yet, as we're re-looking at it, we're looking at the fact that this is very most likely a third lineage. And what we're talking about when we're talking about a third human lineage, we're talking about third from Neanderthal and Denisovan. So this would be a Neanderthal, Denisovan, and then a third lineage. We do know that we have like several different lineages in the fossil record. We do know that we have like 7 different lineages within us. Like we're one lineage, but we have 7 different species, so lineages within us as well. So when we're looking at this as a third human lineage, I'm not sure if third is the right word for it, but I get where they're coming from. So what we're looking at is the possibility of a third group of Homo species, Homo genus, right? A third species of the Homo genus developing in Eurasia. And this species of Homo developing in Eurasia seems to have kind of a convolution of some different attributes that we see within us and that we see within Homo erectus. So the ones that we're looking at that we kind of see within us are the flat face, right? Where there's no mid-face prognosis, right? And we're also kind of seeing that that chin is starting to resemble our chin. It doesn't look like it totally has the bump, but it does look like it has the start of our mental eminence, right? And the mental eminence, again, is that bump that we see on everybody's chin. Even if you have a receding chin, everybody has this little kind of bump there. And this is what we call our mental eminence because we think we're so smart. And it is something that's only seen in our species. And so we're like, we're so smart. So it must be mental. So with this, we don't really see that completely in this skull, but we're seeing the start of it within this skull. Now, so you know, the yellow parts of this skull, let me make sure I'm getting it the right way and not backwards. I believe it's the yellow parts are the mirrored parts and that it is the other parts that are the actual bone. So I want to make sure that that's it. I can't remember off the top of my head, and I'm not seeing right away within this which one is which. I'm trying to make sure because I don't want you guys to think of it as one versus the other. So I believe that what we're looking at is that the yellow parts, right? So it doesn't say, and I know it said somewhere, and I just don't remember which one it had it in, but the 2 different colors is that one of these colors is the actual bone that we have found, and one of these colors is how they've mirrored the bone to the other side so that we could see. So if you look at the chin and you look at the chin on the forward facing one, you can see that part of the chin is in kind of gray and part of the chin is in yellow. So they took one of that side and they mirrored it to the other side so that you could get the full facial reconstruction here. So we are seeing a partial skull that they have been able to mirror into a full skull, basically. So when we're looking at this, what we're seeing is, so this is a whole new species, Tamara. There are a lot more than 3 of the Homo genus. That is absolutely true. So this is a whole new species and we haven't named it yet. Like this just came out today. And so the find is from 2019, or at least that's the earliest articles I can find on it. But they haven't named it. Yeah, and I would guess that the yellow is the extrapolated, but I'm looking at it too. And some of those things that are in yellow, I'm not seeing in white. So I'm not sure how they would have extrapolated them, right? So I see more of the yellow than I do of the white. And I do believe that and we don't see this in us yet, Tamara. We haven't gotten a DNA on it yet. So we don't know yet whether or not it is a ghost or is a species within us. These articles do identify that there is another ghost species in Asia, though. So it's not identifying that this is the ghost species, but it is stating that there is a ghost species in Asia. So there is a possibility of a ghost. That's the first time I've heard of a ghost species in Asia. So I'm going to have to go and do some more digging on that. But these articles are talking about the possibility of a ghost species in Asia. What I'm looking at with this, and I do believe what I read said, and I'm just saying don't take it for the absolute because I can't remember. What I believe I read said that the yellow is what they have found and the gray is what they have mirrored. And I'm going to state that I think that that's probably it because if you look at the back of the jaw. So I'm going to move myself here and I want you to look at the side view. And I want you to look at the way, so this lower part of your jaw is called your mandible, right? And I want you to look at the teeth on this mandible. Now, first they're stating that this doesn't have our chin, right? I can see where it's starting to a little bit, right? But I also totally agree with them that it doesn't have our chin. What we're looking at here with the back of the mandible is important. And this is what's important about that. What's important about that is the gap between the back teeth and the curve of the jaw. So when we're looking at a Homo sapien, we have our jaw curve, our mandible here, right? Our back teeth go right up against our mandible. Our back teeth are right there, but this has a gap. So I know it doesn't look like it's much of a gap, Jedi, but that is actually a gap because we do not have as much of a gap. I am going to let me look at something really quick. I might have stated something wrong on this and I want to make sure that I'm right. Because I think I might have that backwards. So when we're looking at images would work better, Sarah, than the journal article would. Okay, it does. Okay, so I think I'm right on it. Let me double check. Let me make sure that I'm right really quick. Fran, no, you're fine. Okay, I think I am. I want to double check. The skulls that I have on my website actually don't show it very well, and that's what it was confusing me. So let me see if I can find a good mandible representation. So that I can show you what I'm talking about with these teeth. I want to make sure that I'm actually getting the absolute right on it so that I'm not giving you the incorrect information on it, but I also want to make sure that I have some form of an image so that I can show you what I'm talking about with it. Okay, so they call it a retromolar space, and this is actually going to be Shanidar 1. So it wasn't discovered today, but it was published today. It looks like it was discovered in 2019, but the idea that it was a new species is actually published today. That is from the article that I've got behind you, which is on my website. So you can go ahead and look at my website and see this article and get more information. There's also a couple others. So this is called a retromolar gap. This is Shanidar 1, actually. This mandible is Shanidar 1's mandible. So if you're looking at this, that's not what I wanted to do. Some days me and technology don't work worth a shit. There we go. So this here is called a retromolar gap. And we can see this on Neanderthal and Homo erectus. What it is here's your last molar, and there is this gap between the last molar and the curve of the jaw. We do not have this. Our last molar comes right up to here. The skulls on my website don't show this as well as they should just because of the shading, and that's where I was getting confused. This here is the background, right? So this mandible actually goes right here, okay? This is the frontal curve of this mandible, or the curve closest to us of this mandible, right? So you can see that this molar here actually has like almost a whole fingerprint of my finger gap in between this last molar and this. And this is kind of where our wisdom teeth come in. I believe, if I remember correctly, they don't have as many molars as I do, but I'm not exactly sure. And I don't want to say it off the top of my head, but I believe that that's where we used to store our food, right? Chipmunks. Um, so this gap that is like pretty much the same size as a couple of teeth, right? Or at least a tooth. This retromolar gap is something that we don't see in our species, but we absolutely saw within Neanderthals and Homo erectus. And so I want you to go ahead and look at the skull on the screen behind me, because you can see on the skull on the screen behind me that they do have that retromolar gap. This is one of those things that they're like, okay, so that's not sapien, that's more erectus. So the things that they're looking at that they're going, that's more erectus than sapien, are the fact that it has that retromolar gap. It doesn't have the chin that we have, right? It's looking like it's starting to have the chin that we have, but it doesn't. And then it has the heavy brow ridges that we see with erectus, right? So when we're looking at that, those are several features that are absolutely Homo erectus features compared to Homo sapien features. And yet, when we're looking at Homo sapien features on this, we see that they don't have the mid-face prognosis that you see in like Erectus and Neanderthal. They actually have that flat face that you don't see in any other species. We are really the only species that has that flat face, right? They have the flat face that you don't see in any other species. And then they really do look like they're starting to have like a little bit of a bump on their chin. And whereas there is that retromolar gap, we absolutely see that retromolar gap is smaller on this species than it is on Neanderthal or Homo erectus. So with that, we're seeing that these are a combination of different features that we're not seeing in other species. We haven't really named that there are basal to this species. And again, basal means something that is only in a specific species, like our chin is basal to us. It's only here, right? Plans changed. I took him this morning and I just dropped him off at like right before 1. But thank you, Sleepy. I appreciate it. You're right. When we're looking at basal features for this skull, we don't know yet what are the basal features. So we have the side of him, and from what I'm understanding, he actually has a more elongated skull, like Homo erectus, and like we did early on, right? So our skull is pretty elongated early on. It's not until later on that our skull stops being as elongated as it is. I'm trying to make sure that my picture is out of the way so you can see the picture in the background, right? Hi, bird. So when we're looking at this, we're absolutely seeing a species that has a combination. And this is where originally they're like, sorry, it's hard to talk sometimes because my lips start getting weird. And then I have all these things on my lips, like all that lip crud. And I'm like, ugh. It helps if I put some chapstick on. So what we're looking at with this is that combination. And this is why when they're looking at it originally, they're thinking, well, this might be an archaic Homo sapien because it has Homo sapien traits and it has erectus traits. But now they're looking at it and deciding that it's really an entirely new species. So, with what I have so far, I do not see any evidence of behavioral patterns. Um, Let me see. So it is a wide and low brain case. So you can see Atira where you see the forehead, like see, you've got your brow ridge here. And on us, this forehead goes up, it's high, right? But on this one, you can see that that brow ridge is here, but the forehead starts sloping back around here, right? So it's not as high of a brain case as we have, right? So it's a lower and wider brain case than we have, right? So I don't think that this is the only one they have, right? So this is the most complete skull that they have. But because it says that it is HLD6, it means it's the sixth excavation from that. So it's the sixth human excavated in that area, right? So they do have more than just this skull, but they don't have. So I'm not seeing. I am not seeing in any of the articles that I'm seeing that there is a full body, right? Like I'm not seeing a full body on it. Um, that doesn't mean that we don't have like limbs. It's very possible that we have limbs. They just don't have like a full. So Naladi is one of the only like one of the few full skeletons that we have. Like we have like even Australopithecine, we don't have like a full skeleton of. A lot of species we don't have the full skeleton of in one individual. We might have a full skeleton of parts from many different individuals, right? But it's not like I can take the thigh bone from one individual and the lower bone, leg bones, the tibia and fibula from another individual and put them together and get an accurate measurement, right? So they might have like the skull of this individual and then maybe they have like a shoulder girdle of this individual and in another individual they might just have the mandible and the pelvis, right? So there might be a bunch of difference. If I were to guess, and it's not going to be a guess, so the skeletal piece that is most likely to give us DNA, like so actually, okay, cool, awesome, Sleepy, thank you. They do have leg bones, and like I said, there's like this is at least six because this is number six, right? So they probably have pieces of the other beings, they just don't have a full of the other beings, and they don't have a full skull of the other beings, and it is probably the full skull itself that is giving us the most information because of the differences in morphology, right? Um, when we're looking at sorry, I lost it. 1 second and I will get it back. Oh, so the one that we're able to get the DNA out of the most of is inside the ear. It's like a temporal bone or something like that. I can't remember the exact name off the top of my head, but it's a tiny little bone inside the ear. And that's the one that is giving us the most DNA. So it lasts the longest. It's kind of inside the skull, right? And so it actually has a lot of other bone to dissolve before that bone's going to dissolve. A thigh bone is also going to be something that is going to be around a little bit longer. What it is the fact that yes, so I have three articles, two sciphys.org articles, and that one journal article I had sent you earlier, Sleepy, but I do see that people are having a hard time accessing the whole article on that one. So there are at least three articles on my website so that you can take those articles and get a little bit deeper of a dig. But when we're looking at the bones that are lasting, the heavier, the more dense a bone is, the thicker a bone is, the longer it lasts. A hyoid bone is an extremely thin bone, an extremely small bone, so it's one of the first to dissolve. It's hard to find infant skeletons or infant bones because they're small and they're fragile, so they dissolve a lot quicker, right? So when we're looking at bones, what is going to last longer is something that is denser, something that's bigger is going to last longer because there's more of it to dissolve than something that is smaller, it's going to dissolve quicker. So when we're looking at that, you're probably going to find that the most likely bones to last, like a lot of times we don't find foot bones or hand bones because if you think about it, all these are kind of small bones, right? So a thigh bone's going to last a lot longer. The one that's going to give us DNA the best, and this is a recent understanding of the one that's going to give us the DNA the best, is that inner ear bone, right? That is why we find more skull pieces, because a skull itself can be extremely dense, right? Teeth are extremely dense, right? And the mandible itself is extremely dense, right? Excuse me. And the skull itself, this is a very thick bone, right? It's not like as thick as your thigh bone because your thigh bone's like, a good 3 inches around, right? It's not as thick as maybe a hip, right? Because a hip is like like it bends like this, and then it's all like really thick, and then it's got that really thick ball joint on it, right? Ha! I'm pretty sure that George was an animist. He was indigenous, so he was not a Republican or a Democrat. He was indigenous. So when we're looking at that, yeah, and I don't think we actually find a lot of pelvises. I think that we find like I think pelvises are just like so it's really hard because like so we're getting a lot more fossils right now. Like in the last few years we've gotten so many more fossils than we've ever had before. But before that we had like 2000 pieces. Not 2000 complete humans, but 2000 pieces of humans. Um though I would think that that is actually 2000 humans, just not all of them are more than one piece, right? So, like a tooth would be a human and a piece. But if I'm looking at a skull, the entire skull and all of its different fragments, it would count as only one piece in that 2000. So, before about 10,000 years ago, we have about 2000 pieces, right? When it comes to Neanderthal, I think we have like a total of 18 pieces of Neanderthal, though I think that that number is rising with Denisova Cave, right? So when we're looking at different ancient hominins, we don't have very much of our ancient hominins. Uh, my paleoanthropology professor was like, we have so few that we know the name of every one of them. I'm not there yet. Like I could tell you the name of several of them, but I'm not there yet, right? But we have so few that it's so very few. Yeah, I'm pretty sure Nicole that Atira is another indigenous person, and I'm pretty sure that she's in that fight, right? So I'm pretty sure she was being kind of tongue in cheek on that one. But when we're looking at it, we're seeing that we have so few. So I can't say that we have like more pelvises than other things, but I do know that we do have a good portion of pelvises, right? I do know that we have a good portion of teeth. That 1.8 million year old tooth in Georgia that's Homo erectus, right? Teeth are one of those things that kind of live a long time because they're pretty solid, right? Um, and so yeah, totally. And I totally get that, Nicole. And well, and I know because Atira's been in here and because you've been in here, you know how many people will come into my lives and start spouting their political bullshit. And so, I can see where you saw it like, or, you're like, wait a minute, why are you bringing your politics in, right? Um, and so I totally, totally get that. But Atira, well, you've probably seen them you probably know them under a different name. They just recently changed their name, actually. So I'll let them divulge that information, but you probably actually know them. In fact, I think I might have met you through them, actually. So, uh, but anyways, when we're looking at these different things, we're seeing that the denser the bone is, the longer that bone is going to be in the fossil record, right? And so you are going to see that the denser bones are going to be in longer, and you are going to see the temporal bone, I think is what they're calling. It's not temporal. Temporal is part of the skull. It's let me Google what the name of the inner ear bone is. I can do. That is not the three bones inner ear scientific name. I think it's the incus that they're able to actually. There is uh, a bone inside the inner ear that they're actually using to pull DNA out of. I'm trying to see if I can see what the name of it is. But I'm not pulling it through this. So there is an actual tiny bone in the eardrum. And because it's inside the skull, like because it's inside what is also like sinus cavities and stuff like that, it's well protected. And because it's so well protected, it actually means that it stays around a lot longer. And so they're able to actually get DNA out of it better. Um, but, you know, that's just because of how interior it is. It gives that protection so that the DNA can last a lot longer within it, basically. Um, so, an environment of burial site is huge. So, what we know with uh, how we can get DNA and how things dissolve is that different environments are actually going to slow the rate of decay, right? So, one thing that a lot of people do not know is that every element on this planet has what they call a half life, a rate that it decays. The length of time, the half life is the length of time it takes for it to decay by half. I've explained this a little bit within DNA before. And so I'm going to use some really arbitrary numbers that don't mean anything, but it will give you an idea. If you have 100 strands of DNA and you die, until you die, your DNA is replicating all the time. You replace every cell in your body every 7 years. Uh, so once you die, that replication process stops and it starts degrading. And if your half life for DNA is a day, and you have 100 strands of DNA when you die, by the end of the first day, you've lost half of that 100. So you start with 100 and you end with 50. And the start of the second day, you start with 50 and you lose 25, half. And so by the end of the second day, you have 25 strands of DNA. And DNA kind of shrinks. It's not like the strand itself dissolves, it just kind of shrinks because it's a bunch of different copies on one strand. Um, and so if you start your third day with 25 strands of DNA, you end you lose 12.5 during that day, 24-hour period. And at the end of that 24-hour period, you have 12.5, right? So the half life is the time that it takes for a substance to decay by half. With DNA and things like that, the environment that it is in is going to preserve it better. Think of like preserving meat, right? Preserving in salt or bog bodies is a huge one, right? Um, and that's because we find that things that are in extremely cold, dry environments last longer, or things that are fully submerged in, and I can't remember if it's acidic or acrobic. I think it's acrobic. It's acrobic. So things that are completely submerged in water that is acrobic will actually last longer as well, which is why we have those bog bodies and why we have Otzi, because Otzi is an extremely cold, dry environment in the bog bodies. Tar pits are another one. Uh, when we see that, we're seeing a complete submersion in an acrobic environment, and that complete submersion in an acrobic environment preserves it longer. That freeze drying, mummifying in a high, dry, frozen altitude preserves it longer. So the environment is absolutely going to tell us whether it preserves longer or not. One reason why the only things that we have DNA from, the only other species that we have DNA from are Neanderthal and Denisovan is because of the environment of other species. When we look at Homo naledi is in a dry, damp environment. When we look at Homo florensis is in a tropic environment. It's very hot and very muggy. When we look at Luzonzensis, it's going to be the same thing. And so when we're looking at these other species that our only findings of them are in environments that aren't conducive to preservation, we're less likely to get DNA out of them. Yes, those are the inter-ear bones, but I seem to remember that it started with a different, it might be the stapes, Johanna. And thank you for that. I did see those, but I was like, I thought it started with a T, and that's where I'm lost, but I can't remember what it was. But I think it might be the stapes. That's the only thing I can think of. So when we're looking at different environments and the preservation within different environments, we're seeing that some environments are going to preserve longer than others, and then some bones are going to preserve longer than others. This is why paleoanthropology states that the archaeological record is bias, right? We like to think that science doesn't have bias, but science actually has bias. And you have to be aware of the bias, right? You have to understand the bias and you have to work within the bias, right? There is the tympanic membrane, but it's the membrane, so that's not it, right? Like that's what. So I went and I googled, and I'm looking at the ear, and I'm looking at all the parts of the ear, and I'm like, well, that's not it. But that's not it. But that, what the fuck is it, right? So it's probably the stapes. I'm gonna have to look a little bit different just to make sure. But when we look at this, we see that the archaeological record actually has bias. And what it is that the earth itself has bias. It is going to create, like where you're at on the earth is going to bring you back to the earth faster or less, right? Like you're going to preserve longer or less as long, half as long, depending on where you're at on the earth. And so when we're looking at that, we have to see that there is a lot of bias. That bias isn't a human bias, though. And that's something that we should view as important, is that we're not looking at a human bias. We're looking at the fact that everything has bias. And this is a bias that we're not weighting. We're not providing a weight for this bias, right? So when we're looking at that, we do see that bias is everywhere, and that bias within the archaeological record is going to determine what we're able to find, what we're able to do with what we find, how we're able to get DNA, different things like that. Humans do all have bias. I would so tribal. The terminology is really a misnomer. So we look at tribal as meaning something that it really doesn't. All tribe means is a community based on common lineage. So a tribe is a community that is based on a whole bunch of people who have the same genetic lineage, whereas a band is a group of people that don't have the same genetic lineage. And I only state that, I know you know this, I only state that for everybody else, or making sure that everybody knows that the word tribal is kind of a misnomer, just like the word tribe has kind of a misnomer, just because we've associated it currently wrong, right? We don't associate it currently as what it actually is. We associate it as kind of being primitive, which it's not. And we also tend to associate it with specific groups when it's actually something that we've all been doing the whole fucking time, right? So and like I said, I know you know, and I'm not trying to correct you, Jedi. I just want to make sure that everybody knows, because it can be something that is kind of problematic for other groups. And it is also something that can be, seen as attack for some people or things like that because of how it's been used in the past. So when we're looking at this, we absolutely see that there is bias in the archaeological record, and that bias in the archaeological record is going to make it hard for us to find certain things. We have found Neanderthals since the 1850s, right? And yet we didn't find a Neanderthal. Thank you. We didn't find a Neanderthal's hyoid bone until 2015. So up until that point, we didn't think Neanderthals could talk because we hadn't found a Neanderthal hyoid bone. Because the hyoid bone is such a small, tiny, thin bone that it dissolves really quickly, right? Whereas the teeth are such a hard bone and they're going to take a lot longer. And I know you didn't. I know you didn't. And please don't think that I was in any way trying to call you out or to be shitty towards you, because I was not, because I know you didn't. Because I prefer, I would say that the better term for what you were saying was we're all animistic, because we all have that part of the biome. We're all originally knew that we were all part of the biome, right? So animistic might be a better terminology for that, just because when we look at that word, it looks at it differently, right? And animistic is separate from indigenous, right? Because indigenous thought can be animistic, but not all indigenous thought is animistic. The vast majority seems to be, to my knowledge, right? But not all indigenous thought is, because nothing is monolithic, right? So I have to say that it can't all be, because nothing is a monolith, right? So it just separates it out. And so animism, thinking that we're nothing more than animals and we're just part of the biome, is definitely that part of it. So when we're looking at that, it is that bias in the archaeological record that does kind of affect the way that we see things sometimes, like not believing that Neanderthals could talk because we couldn't find a hyoid bone from Neanderthals, and because we hadn't looked at the brain and the imprint of the brain on the skull and what language pathways look like in the imprint of the brain on the skull enough. And we hadn't looked at like chest capacity and how that affects verbal communication. We didn't think that Neanderthals had verbal communication for the longest time. But when we find the hyoid bone, we're like, oh shit, they have verbal communication. And then we take that and we start looking at the skull and see that there's imprint of language in the skull, because your brain kind of leaves an imprint of your skull. right? The outside of your brain kind of leaves this imprint in the inner side of your skull, right? And so we can see that the imprint for language is in the skull. And then we also now know, and partially because of finding the Neanderthal hyoid bone, that the chest capacity and the way that our rib cage is, this gives us the ability to kind of compress and push air up to speak. And so when we now, because we found the hyoid bone and reevaluated the way that we looked at Neanderthals and language, we are able to see language in Denisovan, even because with Denisovan, we only have like, I think it's this, it might be this side, but it's this part of the skull. We have like a little chunk, and that's all we have a Denisovan skull, other than a mandible. But we can see the imprinted language on that. And so we know that Denisovan had language. We haven't found a Denisovan rib cage intact, or like, a full rib cage. Most of Denisovans all fit in the palm of our hand. Like you can fit pretty much everything from Denisovan in the palm of your hand currently. But because we haven't found it, we don't know from the rib cage, and we don't have a hyoid bone, but we can see the imprinted language. We can look at Homo erectus and see the imprinted language in their skull, and see the way that their rib cage is stacked and the way that it sets, and we can see that they had a vocal language. I always want to remind people when I'm talking about verbal language that language exists in everything around you. Trees have language. Trees actually form little matriarchal clans in big nations that are forests. And in forming those little matriarchal clans, everything within a forest actually intercommunicates. So everything on this planet really has extensive language. It just doesn't all have a verbal language like we do, right? So when we're looking at that, it's I wish I could roadkill. The question is, how can I explain how humans got their chins? So far, I haven't seen anything that states that we know why we have our chins. This is one of these things that's just like a what the fuck. It is one thing that we see only in us, like we don't see it anywhere else, but we haven't pinned down what benefit it is for us. Like, what does this do for us? What does this give us, right? But we do know it's only in us, right? And it is one way that we can distinguish that's us and not somebody else. Like within this skull, we can distinguish that this skull isn't a Homo sapien skull because it doesn't have the mental eminence. It looks like it's starting to, as I was talking earlier, but it doesn't. So we know that it's not a Homo sapien skull, right? Um, and it was asked earlier, prior to the live, actually, somebody I was talking about was like, how can we tell that this is not a hybrid of two species? What I would say with that is the fact that we are looking at something that's 300,000 years old. And we know that the first of us is 300,000 years old in an entirely different region. So, too many hominins fall on their jaws and we needed extra protection. That's a great reason to have the mental eminence. I personally think that we got this mental eminence so that we could know that we were wise later on and see the statue of David. See, I think that it's all just interconnected. And we got this so that we can make the statue of David so that we could call ourselves wise, because sapien means wise. Homo sapien means we're wise, right? So, and that's a very strong theory, knowing us, like we always fall. But we know that this isn't a hybrid because we know that sapien is barely existing at the same time that this is existing, right? So it's not like a Homo sapien species. Our species isn't a species whole at the time, right? Our very archaic representations of us, very old representations of our very start of our species is around, but us as a species whole to be a separate species to hybridize with a different species isn't around. So we know that this isn't a hybridization. We also know that this isn't something that we're descending from or an archaic form of us. And this is because of the fact that we see that we're starting at the same time that we find this. Our oldest finding is now sapien is now 300,000 years old in Morocco. And this is in China at 300,000 years ago, right? So we know that we do use our chin to rest our big brains, but our brains aren't the biggest brains. The biggest brains are actually Homo Neanderthal brains, and they did not have our chin. So it's a great theory and thought, especially with the tongue in cheek of it. And yet it doesn't actually mesh out because our brains aren't the biggest. I know that's hard for some of us to take, but we are not the biggest. We're not as well-brained as we like to think we are. It is the shape of our brain, they've discovered, that actually gives us the knowledge that we have. And this actually is coming from the 5 life stages that we have. So every other animal on the planet from neonate to adult has shorter life stages and less of them. We have long life stages, and we from neonate to adult, and we have 5 of them. We're the only species that has 5. Neanderthal only had 4. And it is these 5 life stages that we think increases the malleability of our brain. And what that is think of so neonate is newborn to adult. Our brain fully forms and is closing at 25 currently. It probably was a few years earlier beforehand. And so what this means is that you think of that first 2 years of a life, and that first 2 years of the life, you're learning so much, right? And so we have this extended length of time. Some species are like a snake. It's born and it goes, right? An elephant, though, has longer life stages, and I think an elephant is like 5 years, right? Um, it is the extended time during those life stages that our brain grows. Like, so if our brain is able to grow and develop for a longer period of time, then our brain is able to pick up more information and know more information. And it becomes more malleable. It becomes more capable of learning, right? And so we think that this is why we have the shape of our brain. And that shape is why we have the intelligence level that we think we do. Um, I'm a little bit, dolphins are smarter. I'll take any species that doesn't believe that it has to change the world around it, but would rather change the world it is in, personally, because, and it is. They call it, well, okay, so the creation of synapses has long been what we thought is actually the intelligence. We're not sure anymore. And that only came out like 2 months ago. Like they're looking to see if that's actually what it is, if it is the faster firing synapses. They believe that our synapses fire faster than Neanderthal synapses, and that's why they believe that we were smarter than Neanderthals. I'm still up for debate on that. But when they look at that, they're starting to go, well, shit, is it the synapses or is it something else that is actually creating what we've got, right? Just to make sure. When we're looking at that, like with this skull, we see that this skull has a low brain case and it has a long brain case, right? Which is something that we see in Erectus, which is something that we see in Neanderthal, which is something that we see in many of the archaic humans. In fact, we are the ones with the highest brain case so far, right? Shit, let me look at something. That makes sense. Okay, so when we look at Naledi's skull is slightly higher, but it's not quite as high as ours is. And while they have kind of a jutting chin, they don't have mid-face prognosis. They have lower face prognosis. But they do still have that low sloping skull. And I'm wondering only because of the fact that we know that Naledi is smarter than us before us. We know that Naledi was better than us before us. But they do have the same shape of the skull that we do. So I'm going to show you something really quick. This is a comparison between Homo naledi's skull and an ancient sapien skull. This is not a modern sapien skull. It doesn't give the timeline. It just says it's the Kabwe skull from Zambia. It doesn't tell us exactly where it is. But if you look at this, or exactly the time, but if you look at this, you can see that the ancient us were not as rounded in our skull as we are now. This is a little bit longer than our skull now. Whereas we see that Naledi has a rounder skull, more like we do now than we did at that time frame. And this is one of those things that they're actually looking at right now when they're looking at the shape of the skull as mattering more than the size of the skull. You can see that. So this, when we look at Naledi, this is a lower face prognosis. It's not flat faced. That's not what I wanted to do. Sorry, ad popping up. It's not flat faced like the skull behind me, right? It has this lower face prognosis, and it still has this kind of heavy brow ridge. Now you can see that in archaic Homo sapien here, that there is a bit of a heavier brow ridge here, and that it is a slightly slower sloping skull that's a little bit longer, right? And we see this with Naledi that actually they kind of, it's roughly the same kind of slope, right? It's roughly the same kind of forehead, right? And so we can see that within ancient sapiens, it was a little different, right? But when we're looking at this skull behind us, we see that it doesn't all really have as much of that kind of backward slope that the skull that we just looked at did, right? So again, we can see that there are differences within this skull from Homo sapien at the same time frame and from Homo erectus at the same time frame. I'm going to go over those again for anybody who's just coming in. And then actually I'm going to take off in roughly 20 minutes because I got to leave around 3. So just so everybody knows up front, so when I start taking off at 3 o'clock, but we've got, it's like 2:30 here. There are 2:36 here, so probably 24 minutes. When we're looking at this skull behind us, let me go over all of this just a little bit of touch again. So this is new remain or not new remains, new publication on a find that they found a little bit ago in China. And this new publication on this find, I'm going to try and get myself completely out of the way so you can see everything. This new publication on this find actually has looking at the idea that this is a new species. This is they're saying third human lineage. I would think that it would be a little bit more than third. I think that we're looking at something that, I mean, we know that there's like 6 in the fossil record at our timeline. But this would be currently what we know of human species within mainland Eurasia, living at the same time as us, or lineage at the same time as us, is Neanderthal and Denisovan. We do know that Erectus is living there, but Erectus has been there for quite some times, and they're not like our peers is not the word that I wanted to say, but the word that I wanted to say is not working in my brain right now. I can't think of it. Contemporary. There are contemporaries, right? We do see that Homo erectus does live contemporary to us, but we also see that Homo erectus is around like 2 million years before us, and Homo erectus kind of creates us, right? So when we're looking at this, this is the third within Eurasia that we have found that we're absolutely certain is a different species, right? So currently that would be Neanderthal, Denisova, and this one. Now, Longi, we have also found in the Long Cave in China. And the reason that Longi is not the third lineage is because we're not sure yet whether or not Longi is Denisovan or not. We don't have DNA from Longi, and we don't have a skull from Denisovan, right? So when we do that, we are definitely looking at this being something that is, because they have an almost complete skull, they're able to tell whether or not it is a different human, a different genus Homo species than Denisovan, Neanderthal, or Sapien, right? And so that's why they're saying third lineage. And that's why, and it's because it is on mainland Eurasia, right? Whereas Florensis and Luzonensis are in the islands. And some of the other, Naledi is in Africa, and there's some other species within Africa, but this is the third within mainland, right? And what we're looking at with this skull, we're looking at something, and I've got 3 articles on my website underneath bibliographies and new humans. And when we're looking at these, we're looking at something that they started discovering in 2019. The first publication seems to be in 2021. Yet this idea that they've solidified that this is a new species, they originally thought it was an archaic sapien, and they've solidified that it is not an archaic sapien because they've been able to compile an almost complete skull. And in being able to compile an almost complete skull, they've been able to get more information. And so I'm actually going to give a couple of different things that we see within this skull. So first, we need to know that basal traits are traits that are associated with a basal trait is something we only see within that species. So something that is basal to our species is our mental eminence. It's this little jut out portion in the bottom of our chin. It's our chin is something that we see only in us. This makes it a basal trait. When we're looking at this skull, we can see that there are a couple of different species traits within it, but it's not necessarily that it's a hybridization. So I'm going to go over some of the different traits that we see. First, what I want to go over is some of the traits that we see that are erectus traits or from other species that we see. So one of the things that we see is this very heavy M-shaped brow ridge here, right? And this very heavy M-shaped brow ridge is something that we see in Homo erectus, something that we see in Neanderthal. We're not sure yet with Denisovan because we don't have a skull of Denisovan, but it is definitely something that we see within other Homo species prior to us. And then I have to look at myself while I talk. I don't know why. I just have to. So I have to move that again because I have a camera set up for YouTube that's on my phone. So when we're looking at this skull, what we're also seeing within this is that it has the gap between the last tooth. You can see it on this side of it, the side view. You can see this gap, retromolar gap between the last molar and the curve of the mandible. This is something that we see in Erectus and something we see in Neanderthal. And we do have a mandible of Denisovan, and we do see this in Denisovan as well. We see this in really every other species of Homo but us, and all the other hominin species as well. Not having that retromolar gap is another basal sapien trait, which means, again, a trait that we only see within Homo sapiens. So this species does have a retromolar gap. This retromolar gap is a little bit less than we see in Erectus or in Neanderthal. Neanderthal's retromolar gap could fit a whole other molar in it. This one doesn't seem to be able to. And then we're also seeing that it has a low skull that is long, right? And that is, again, an Erectus trait or a Neanderthal trait. And what we're talking about here with low is they don't have the high forehead over the arches of the brow ridge that we do. And it's longer in its front to back movement, right? The things that we see that, and we also see within this that it doesn't have the mental eminence on the chin. To me, it looks like it's starting to, though. And so it might look like that to you as well. They are stating that it does not have the sapien chin, though. And that is because whether or not it's starting to, it clearly doesn't have the full sapien chin, right? So what we are seeing within this that is actually more sapien in appearance is the flat face, right? The face that is not having that mid-face prognosis and not having a lower face prognosis, like I was just showing you with Naledi having that lower face prognosis. So we are the only species that we have found so far that has that flat face. And because this has that flat face, it's showing features from a couple of different species. Now, many of us would think, well, that means it's a hybrid of this species. It's not a hybrid of two species. And the reason that we know that it's not a hybrid of two species is well, first of all, there's several of them, right? Like, so this is number 6. So they have a few others. And so while they don't have a full skull probably of any others, they do have comparison parts for others. And then the other thing within this, and that's what they thought originally, Jedi, but it's not. And the reasoning is from my understanding, the reasoning that they're deciding that it is not an archaic sapien, because that's what they originally thought, and then they're translating it into something else, is because it doesn't really have a lot of basal sapien traits. The only basal sapien trait that it really has, the only real sapien trait that it has is that flat face, right? And even in that flat face, I want you guys to note a couple things that I noted. So our nose is not as wide as this nose is. Our nose is very narrow. The holes in our skull of our nose are very narrow. This is very wide. The other thing, and this one is really unusual of, like, I haven't seen this in any other species. The way that the upper jaw is shaped looks weird to me. And I can't exactly explain to you what it is that looks weird to me. I think it looks flatter and kind of almost wider, but at the same point, I mean, there's just some weirdness to it, like something to it that's like, oh, I've never seen that before. That's a little interesting, right? And so these are a couple of different things that, okay, so you can kind of see it on the side view. You can see where the upper lip kind of almost sticks out. The same way that the Naledi, yeah. So the same way that Naledi starts, it has that lower face prognosis, but that flat upper face or that dished upper face with that lower face prognosis, it almost looks like it has, like, the flat face starts to dish out with that upper lip. Now, it doesn't have the lower face prognosis. It's still a very flat face, but there is this kind of dishing out of the upper lip. And combined with the fact that it is still flat, right, and kind of wide, it's kind of interesting. I've never seen anything like that before. This is really unique. This might end up being a basal trait of this species, right? Naledi is Neledi, just so y'all know. But when we're looking at this, and just because people are, if you're Googling it, so you have the right spelling. So when we're looking at this, we're seeing that there are features that we're not seeing anywhere else, features that we are seeing in Erectus and Neanderthals, and features that we're seeing in the very same timeline starting to develop in Africa and Sapien. So this is 300,000 years old, and the oldest Sapien that we have in Africa is in Morocco at 300,000 years old. So these are two different spaces, half a globe apart. And the only feature that we're seeing that's very sapien in this is that flat face. Everything else within this isn't really sapien. So this tells us it's not necessarily an archaic sapien. And it also tells us that it's not a hybrid between two different species. Sapien is just starting to develop. It hasn't solidified as a species. We don't solidify as a species until 125 to 135,000 years ago, right? And when we're looking at this, that means that it's not like it's Erectus and Sapien meeting up and breeding and making a hybrid, right? And so we're seeing that there are, again, basal traits from Erectus and basal traits from Sapien, and yet kind of new basal traits as well, are kind of new traits. Am I buffering? We don't know, Kylie, if this guy is typical or really odd for his species. I would state that because we know that there are other skull finds within this, not a complete, but other pieces, right? So like, if I have another mandible, I don't have the full skull, but I have another mandible, and I can compare the teeth space and I can compare the chin of the under mandible and go, okay, so this is typical of this species. The same thing with the brow ridges. I might not have a full skull cap, but I might just have that brow ridge. If I can compare that brow ridge in one find to the brow ridge in this find, then I can see that that is typical of the species. And because this is HLD6, which again means it's the sixth fossil find of a human, of a person, in this, it does mean that there are 5 before this. And it doesn't say on any of them that I saw yet. I'm good. Like I said, this came out this morning. I was going pee this morning and saw this and went, ah, and texted Sleepy and went, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. So with this, I have a lot more work to do to see all the different things. We're going to have a lot more work to see within it, but we do see unique features within it. And the unique features within it, and the fact that there are a few of them in this site that probably all share the same unique features, would tell us that they're probably things that they're finding that are unique to this species, just because, right? Yes. So the cave itself is the Hulong Dong. Dong means cave. So Hulong Cave in East China. And so what we're looking at is that when we number them, what we're numbering is the excavation that we get. So like Shanidar 1 is the first excavated fossil skeleton person from Shanidar Cave. There's like Shanidar 1 through 9, I believe. I think 9 is a new one, like because they reopened Shanidar Cave, and they're continuing excavation of Shanidar Cave, right? So I think 9 is the new excavation out of Shanidar Cave. So when we're looking at this, I'm going to say it is the yellow that is the actual skull itself, and it is the white on this image itself that is the replicated. And the reason I'm going to say that is because if you look at the side view and you see the pieces of the skull, if I was to replicate that, I would replicate it as a full instead of in several different pieces. So I do think, and I also wouldn't have, like you can see in this little piece right down here, where it it's almost like a little chunk, but it kind of has a line onto it, right? So that is something that you're really only going to see in like the actual bone itself. It's not something you're going to replicate. So I do think it is the yellow that is the original bone. It is the white that is the mirrored. Just so, because we talked about that earlier. And as I'm looking, because I've got it up on my screen too, and I'm looking at it a little bit deeper. When we're looking at this, this is the 6th fossil because it's the number 6. BJ581 is the grave that I work on from Sweden. in the island of Björkö and Lake Mälaren in Sweden. Um, and not work on, like it's the one that I study from a distance. I haven't made it to Sweden yet. Um, when we look at BJ581, BJ stands for Bjorko, because Bjorko is BJORKO, right? So BJ stands for the site itself. 581 means it's the 581st grave excavated at that site. So the letters in the front stand for the site itself, and the number following it stands for the number of the excavation. So which it is in the which number of grave is excavated, or which number of fossil is excavated. So we know that there are 6 at least, right? Because this is HLD6, right? Um, so my understanding would be that there are comparisons with other parts. So the initial focus was in the jawbone, the mandible, and that's because of the unique features there. It's got the triangular lower edge, right, and a unique bend, right? So I'm going to point these out to you as well. So the unique bend is going to be at this backward area here, right? And the way it's bent is unique to this species. And then yeah, I'm really weirded out that they're saying it doesn't have a mental eminence, because it looks like it has a start of a mental eminence, and it's really kind of weirding me out. But that triangular lower edge, and a unique bend. So that triangular lower edge is probably just the way the shape of this part of the mandible is, right? Yes, KV5 is Kings Valley 5. It's the 5th tomb excavated from the Kings Valley. Absolutely, that's exactly what it is. Um, so that's the first thing that they saw on this that was unique for them. And then they don't find a chin, like I was stating, but they also are noting within it the flat face. They ruled out Denisovan. They believe it's not Denisovan or Erectus or Neanderthal, and it's closer to Sapien. So it is going to share some evolutionary relationships with Sapien. But it's not going to be from Sapien, and it is not going to be what Sapien comes from. Oh, okay. So this website, or this article, is referencing a possible presence of a ghost lineage, and we were talking about that in this beginning. That might be the ghost species that we see in Neanderthal and Denisovan. I don't know yet. Again, I'm going to have to look into that one a little bit more. We're seeing, and I'm going to just I'm going to read for a minute. Recent studies from some late Pleistocene humans emphasize their mosaic combination of derived characteristics resembling those of modern humans and primitive or archaic features. I do not like those words. Archaic works a little bit better. Low vault, robust supraorbital structure. That is that brow ridge, the supraorbital structure, and a strong maxillary incisor lingual tubercle. So if I remember correctly, the lingual tubercle is a part of the way that the bone is coming out here. But I can't remember off the top of my head, to be very honest with that one. So they're also looking at a couple of different sites. So comparative studies with the Dolly cranium with this one combines the Dolly cranium combines characteristics of early and middle Pleistocene Homo erectus with modern human-like features, including broadest cranial position occurring at the posterior temporal region and a flattened face. So a couple of these things that we're seeing is they're seeing it in a couple more spaces. It's not just in this site. They're comparing it to a couple of different spaces. Again, after they find this and they see it, and then they start looking a little bit more in depth, right? And then let me see if I can see. The Hulong Cave site is located in Dongxi County, Anhui province in China. The initial excavation started in 2006, and it yields a hominin frontal fragment and a lower second molar. Renewed excavations start taking place annually between 2014 and 2019, and result in the discovery of numerous additional hominin fossils: a partial cranium, mandible, teeth, and 3 partial femora, which is your femur is your leg bone, your thigh bone. Cumulatively, 27 human fossils have been recovered at Hulongdong, representing a minimum of 16 individuals. So we do see, Atira, are you still here, Lovity? So we do see that there are 16 individuals in this site. So they are comparing between the 16 individuals. So it is not something that is going to be abnormality within this person, right? It is something that they're seeing in several of the different ones. I don't know if Atira is still here, but they are evidence of cut marks on faunal remains in the same brecciated deposits would be a demonstration of the human activity. So this is telling us that they were butchering faunal remains. It doesn't say what the faunal remains are. That's animals. So it doesn't say what faunal remains are. And this one is a juvenile. HLD6 is a juvenile partial cranium and mandible. What I dislike is words that I do not understand, because I understand lots of words, but some words are weird. Okay, so that makes sense. Okay, so I'm going to show you guys something really quick again, and then I'm going to go ahead and take off because I've got like 3 more minutes left here. So I want you to compare the view of this with what we have down below. So when we're looking at this, what we're seeing is that, let me look at something really quick. Okay, yeah, there's nobody there. I'm going to go ahead and take this off. So if you're on YouTube and I'm not seeing that you're on YouTube, I apologize. It's just going to make it a little easier for me. So when we're looking at this, what we're looking at is a mandible of a Homo sapien, okay? When we're looking at the mandible of this human, we're seeing that the mandible on the Homo sapien that we see this right here where it's way more pronounced and it kind of curves up here. We're not seeing that angle on this. Is that better? Can you hear me better now? I have my finger underneath it is probably why. Let me know. Can you hear me better now? Oh, awesome. Okay, so we're seeing here that this mandible, can you see how there's this kind of big kind of like curve here that we're not seeing on the bottom of this skull? Let me do this way. And give me just a second. I'm going to try and pull these up side by side so that you can see side by side. Let me pull this one up completely. Definition of the mandible. I'm going to put you over on here so you're not seeing me scroll down because it can be a little bit hard to watch somebody just scrolling through things. There it is. So I want to make sure that they're kind of side by side here so that you can see what we're doing here. So if you're looking over here, you can see that there is this kind of pronounced curve here. But if you're looking here, it goes flat here. It doesn't curve upward, right? And if you're looking over here, you're seeing where there's this mental eminence here, the mental protuberance, right? Mentalis. This is the mentalis here, but this is the mental protuberance, right? And you can see within here, this kind of little bump here shows maybe like it's starting, but it's not really there, right? Now, if you look here, you can see how the molars go all the way up to the back of this curve. And you can see here how there's this gap between the molars and this curve. These are all really big differences between these two skulls, right? Yeah, we can see the new find already on TikTok. I believe it. I haven't done a video on it, but I do believe it's out there. So when we're looking at the mental trigon, which is not on this page, I'm going to put you back on my face for a second while I see if I can find a mental trigon. So that I can show you what they mean by a mental trigon. But some of these are not giving me like the actual thing. They're not. And I'm trying to see if I can. I have to remind myself. Aha. Okay. That's what it is. Let me see if I can get a forward view here. And then I'm going to go ahead and take off. But let me see if I can get a forward view so you can see, and it's not going to do that. So the mental trigon is this right here. It's a part of that mental eminence, but it's where it kind of converges into this triangular shape here. And so they're seeing that right in here, this is what they're talking about right here. You can kind of see it where it kind of comes up a little bit, right? This is what I was talking about where I'm like, it kind of looks like the start of a mental eminence. And it's not quite a mental eminence, but it does kind of look like the start of a mental eminence. And that's what this is right here, and the way it kind of comes up and creates this chin area here, right? So it is definitely like a convergence, right? Instead of it definitely has this thought process or this show that we're looking at kind of a new species, right? A new something that's coming out here. I'm going to go ahead and take off because I got some things to do this afternoon. I will be back maybe tomorrow. I don't know. I've got other people have plans tomorrow, so I might have time tomorrow. And we'll probably talk about this, or we'll discuss race theory, because that's the other thing that I want to discuss. We'll see. And let's keep an eye out on this, and I'll be bringing more information to you guys as I find more information on this, because this is a really cool thing. Thank you everybody for coming in and participating and being a part of this. I really appreciate it. And remember, before you leave, and if you haven't been in my lives before, this will be new. Trust me, I'm not going to go over all the things, but trust me when I say that I can show you biologically how we as a species are innately nurturing and innately communal and innately creative. And currently, we have a lot of lack of those things. So very many of us are feeling a depth of depression and a depth of pain at the lack of those things. We might feel like, this isn't how life is supposed to be. And for many of us, this will lead to a depression that can cause self-harm. And I want everybody to please remember that if you feel that, it means that you're right. Like there's nothing wrong with you, right? If you feel a lack of give a shit about everybody else, there might be something wrong with you. But if you are living in a space or a thought process where you're really depressed because of this lack that you're feeling, that lack is a need that we have that we don't get right now. So please remember that you are the necessary one. You are the ones, the people that feel like that are the ones that are going to be able to create that change to move us back where we are supposed to be at. We are innately nurturing. We are innately communal. And all of this thought process of othering, all of this thought process that you should hate somebody, all of this thought process that the Democrats or the Republicans are paying people to demonstrate or different things like this, this thought process against homeless, houseless people, this thought process against immigrants. This is what we call othering. And this is something that is created to keep the narcissistic dog kings in power. So unity is better. Community is better when we can look at each other and understand that You're not the problem and I'm not the problem. The problem is up there and it's trying to destroy you. It is trying to take away community. It's trying to take away nurturing. When we can understand that, we can change that. You are innately nurturing. You are innately communal and you are innately creative and you are needed and valued. You are necessary and you are, oh God, the word in my head is worthy. And it's absolutely true, but I don't want that word because it's not the word that I want. But you are necessary to us. You are necessary to our species as enrichment and continuation. Much love to everybody out there. Valued. Thank you. You're innately valued by our society. Being here, being present is a value to our species continuation. You don't have to provide value to other people or be exploitable to be necessary to be valued. Much love, everybody. Take so much care, and I will see you maybe tomorrow, maybe Monday. Bye.